So, why abolitionism and not like mainstream pro-lifism or the pro-life movement?
Sure, great question. So, well, what's been building and coming into fruition for the last, several years has been an increasing dissatisfaction and with the pro-life movement at large. What we might call the pro-life industry. This realization that we've been coming to for years that just as many babies die under pro-life Republicans as they do under pro-choice Democrats. And so, for me, I got into this fight 22 years ago, first time I stood in front of an abortion clinic. And as a baby Christian at 19 years old, 6 months prior to that, was consenting to my own child's death in an abortion clinic. And, God radically saved me at 19 years old and went to an abortion clinic, saw an image of an aborted baby and was just blown away and realized this is an awful thing. We've got to expose this. We've got to show this to the American people. And as a young Christian, I went through 4 years of high school, never had a Christian share the gospel with me, never had a Christian reach out to me. Realized there's millions of young people here walking the streets confused and a broken mess who the church is not reaching. And the fruit of that, the fruit of the church hiding and cowering and compromising is the bloodshed we see filling our streets in a multitude of ways. The brokenness and the suicide and the drug addiction and of course the proliferation of abused, abandoned, neglected, and aborted children. And this all flows together. It's the fruit of godlessness. It's the fruit of the breakdown of manhood and masculinity in our culture, and men forsaking their duties of service, sacrificial service and love, and their protective role and their protective duties as men. And so this is at the heart of Christianity. This is the heartbeat of Christianity is Christ coming into this earth as the body of a man, laying down his life, the strongest man that ever lived, the most powerful man that ever lived, the most intelligent man that ever lived, and yet laid his life down, served, washed his disciples' feet, lays his life down. And that's been what has, of course, transformed Western civilization. So it's transformed the world and continues to transform the world as the gospel and the kingdom advance. And so America is now suffering due to the what we call the secularization of our country, and that secularization has led to the emasculation of Christianity and the emasculation of Christian men. And there's no better place that that's seen than behind the pulpits of our country and in the legislative halls of our country, where men who profess to be pro-life, men who were elected on a platform of being pro-life, who recognize and call themselves Christians, who recognize that these are human beings made in the image of God, and yet who do almost nothing in defense and in protection of their neighbor. To think that we had George Bush as our great evangelical president from the year 2000 to the year 2008. George Bush was elected by a predominance of pro-life Christians. He had a pro-life Congress, and he called himself pro-life. The majority of Supreme Court justices during the Bush administration were Republican appointed.
All Republicans.
Through the entire Roe era, the majority of Supreme Court justices have been Republican appointed. So for Bush's 6 of 8 of Bush's years in office, pro-life Republicans controlled all 3 branches of our federal government, and they controlled the majority of the states. And guess what? Just as many babies died under George Bush, as had died under Bill Clinton.
That's right.
Just as many babies have died under Donald Trump as have died under Barack Obama.
That's correct.
And so at some point you recognize we have to get off the hamster wheel.
The pro-life hamster wheel.
It's a hamster wheel. We have all this influence. We have all this voice. We have all this angst. You look at all this influence that pro-life people have. We win elections.
Right.
Far more than the pro-choice people have. And yet there's this bottlenecking of our power and influence, and you look at the results, the actual policy change, it's nothing. When we get nothing. Crumbs. And so that's a result of one simple fact. The leadership of the Republican Party, though they identify as pro-life, they don't care about abortion. They do not care about abortion. In fact, many of them probably are pro-abortion. But they know they need pro-life votes.
Correct.
So they play this game. And naive or compromised or ignorant or we could make all types of speculations about the motives, but I don't want to impugn people's motives that I don't know. But the fact is, there are pro-life leaders who are sucked into this game and are basically compromised by pro-life leaders in legislative halls across our country, and they say, this is the best we can do. This is all we can do. We can't do anything because the courts have said we can't do anything. We're going to pass a bill that's going to say, that a woman has to wait 24 hours before she kills her baby. And so we're writing pro-abortion laws. The pro-life movement has been writing laws that are affirming the right for a mother to kill her baby.
That's correct.
And calling it pro-life and celebrating it as a victory.
Yeah.
Imagine Martin Luther King marching down to Selma when black people are being denied the right to vote, black women are being beaten and attacked by police officers and by gangs of men. And imagine he goes down there and he says, hey, I just went and met with the police department down here and the state leadership, and guess what? They're going to let everybody over the age of 70 vote. No problems. Yeah. Hey, let's throw a party. Let's celebrate. We achieved a great victory. Now I'm going back up north. We would say, what are you talking about?
It's insanity.
That's an absurdity.
Yeah, it's straight insanity.
It would never be acceptable. He stood down there, rocked the boat, risked his life, and said, no, we're going to secure the voting rights for all people down here, period. And we're not going to compromise or budge from that. And we will get beaten, we will get attacked, and we'll get persecuted, but we're not going to budge. And guess what? They won. They won.
That's right.
And we are not winning. We are losing, and we will continue to lose until we get the courage and the fortitude to stand on clear principle and say, no, we're not going to lay our hand or set our hand to any bill, any legislative strategy that legitimizes the killing of a human life.
Yeah, it's the same thing with, if I can just add to that before I forget, I've said this to people in the pro-life movement that they do support regulatory bills, and they think this is doing some good. And I give them the numbers of how many babies have been saved by regulatory, which is way less than 1%. You don't see it. I've seen one time a doctor turned a woman away because she was too far along. That's it. And they just tell them get it earlier. Get the abortion earlier. But I ask the people in the pro-life movement that support this stuff, if the Democratic Party legalized pedophilia right now, would you sign into law that you shall not rape children, but 7.5-year-olds is okay?
Right, certain ages.
7.5-year-olds,
Yeah.
7.5-year-olds is
Yes,
all right. Would you sign that? And
it's
would you
awful.
back
Yeah,
that? And
absolutely
every
not.
one of them says, absolutely not. I said, well, why do you do it with
Why do you do it with
babies
abortion?
with a woman?
Because we've been fed a lie.
That's right.
And because people don't know. And so, I didn't vote for George Bush. I saw him as a fake conservative. Mm-hmm. I saw him as a morally corrupt individual,
right,
pandering to the evangelical vote, and naive evangelicals supporting him. And of course, the alternative was worse. Sure, we don't. The Democratic Party, of course, is going 100 miles an hour down the path of destruction, and the Republicans, are trailing behind them in a more conservative manner at about 35, a safe speed of about 35, right? But they're both going in the same direction. This is why Republicans get elected and they don't change anything. Democrats passed Obamacare, Democrats legalized quote unquote homosexual marriage. Republicans ran on these platforms, they're going to change it. They get in office, they don't change it.
They don't.
And within a decade, it's established law and it's accepted, and all these conservative states are now protecting and sanctioning what were the radical leftist victories of the prior swinging of the pendulum. And so I've watched it for 20 years, and so we've never set our hand to that. But thankfully, I didn't even involve myself really in the political side of things for a long time. We preached the gospel on the streets. Was a campus preacher. We did campus evangelism and outreach and apologetics, and worked at discipling young men, and that's where we set a lot of our hands to. And what sort of set me back into the political arena was the personhood movement that came around 2008 and was calling pro-lifers to a more principled, and more gospel-centered, and more immediatist approach, that we need to center our arguments around the facts and the truth of what God says about abortion, that these are babies made in the image of God, and from the moment of conception, it's a human being that deserves to be loved and protected, and that is it. And so the personhood movement unleashed a lot of good things, and many of the pro-life movement sort of pushed the personhood folks aside. Well, they're personhood people, they're not part of the pro-life movement,
Right.
And so that began to sort of set in motion some things and pave some way, and then there was the abolitionist movement that has come on the scene. We've been very encouraged by it, been able to be a part of it and help shepherd some of that. And so things like the book by Pastor Matt Chiuella, my pastor,
Yeah.
The Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates.
And your father-in-law.
And my father-in-law.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
The Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates, a phenomenal work that in conjunction with the principles of abolitionism.
And the Magdeburg Confession.
And the Magdeburg Confession.
Did you know that Me and Chastity got married on the anniversary of the Magdeburg.
Did you really?
Yes, we did.
Hey.
I didn't know that until last week,
No,
so
that's cool.
don't act like I did it on purpose.
He wasn't planned.
No, it wasn't.
No, okay.
But I just found it out. I told
That's
Matt,
good.
and his eyes lit up. He's
Right.
like, really? And I'm
Right.
like, yeah.
What a great document,
April
lost to
13th.
history. Yeah, lost to history. And so this idea that courts don't make law, that we've been believing a lie for 40 years, that the courts have to be obeyed,
Right.
and that states are essentially powerless to do anything, and that our only hope was in overturning Roe versus Wade and maybe passing a constitutional amendment at the federal level. And so we put all of our eggs in the basket of the federal government, while the federal government has grown over the last 40 years into this monster of corruption and iniquity that's not going to rein itself in. And so pro-life groups pander to that.
Right.
And I know good pro-life people who don't realize how compromised and absurd their political strategies have become because they acquiesce to that.
That's right.
I mean, we have pro-lifers literally writing bills, giving vivid, detailed descriptions of how to dismember a baby,
Yeah.
and calling it a pro-life bill.
Yeah.
And so that's because the Supreme Court has ruled, and the courts, federal courts have ruled that you cannot pass any law at the state level that places an undue burden, quote unquote, undue burden on Roe. So that means, in layman's terms, the courts are saying you can't pass any bill that significantly, impacts a woman's right to get an abortion, or significantly impacts, or is it a significant impediment to abortion? So if that's your premise, if your political strategy starts with the premise that whatever I do, it cannot and will not significantly pose an impediment to a woman's right to an abortion, then what you guarantee is whatever you do legislatively will not pose an impediment to an abortion.
Yes, right.
No, but that doesn't sound good to say that. Pro-life organization is raising money and they have careers and salaries and they're trying to do something that they think is useful and worthwhile. It doesn't sound good to say, hey, you know what, guys? All of our donors and our followers, we cannot do anything that will significantly pose an impediment to a woman's right to an abortion. That doesn't sound good. Who would, in their right mind, support that? So instead, we say things and we twist things, we muddy the waters so it can give the appearance we're accomplishing something when we're actually accomplishing worse than nothing. We're not even just getting tackled in the line of scrimmage, we're getting tackled in the backfield. Because not only are these terrible laws not moving the ball forward, we're miseducating the public. We're telling the public that, hey, baby feels pain at 20 weeks, and that's when abortion should really be banned, is after 20 weeks, because it feels pain. Or, a baby doesn't have a heartbeat till 8 weeks, and that's when it's wrong to kill a baby, is after it has a detectable heartbeat.
Right.
And all these laws, are miseducating. We wonder why we have so many miseducated people, and why so many pro-lifers can't even articulate the basic principles upon which we stand, and there's so much muddle-headedness within the pro-life movement itself. Well, because the pro-life leaders are passing legislation that is confusing people morally, and so law has a didactic function. It's a teacher, it's an instructor.
That's right.
And we've been confusing people with the laws we've been passing. Also, what we've been doing every time we pass one of these bills, who wouldn't sign on to a bill that says you can't kill a baby after 20 weeks?
Right.
That then has numerous exceptions that still allow for it in certain circumstances.
That's right.
You haven't stopped one single abortion.
But you're codifying a law. You shall murder babies.
You
under
are.
20
You're codifying a law. You can't get an abortion, Chris, in France after 12 weeks. Our conservative pro-life laws would be considered liberal in France.
That's insane.
And so we're miseducating people.
Yeah.
Terribly. And then what we're doing is, there's Democrats, many Democrats who'd say, yeah, you probably shouldn't kill a baby after 20 weeks in the womb. That's kind of gross. They'll sign on to that. So what are you doing? Now, when it comes time for re-election, we've just given bad Republicans, pro-abortion Republicans who are in the closet, don't want to come out, they want to get their pro-life credentials, get their little pro-life tag stamped, so on re-election time they can say, hi, I'm pro-life, I fought for pro-life. Well, what did you do? Well, I did all the pro-life groups asked me to do, and all the pro-life groups asked me to do was sign a bill that says you can't kill a baby after 20 weeks. But then you can. After 20, before that you can. First 19 weeks, go ahead and kill the baby, right? So we're giving cover to bad pro-life, quote-unquote, Republicans who are in office who are actually keeping abortion legal. So these pro-life bills are bad on so many levels. And I could go on and on about other reasons why they're bad. They're unenforceable. There's nobody enforcing these. There's no district attorneys. There's no police officers that are going down there and saying, hey, are you 21 weeks? Because you can't get an abortion. You know, the abortion clinic's not going to self-regulate. They're not going to be like, ma'am, we'd love to take your $3,000 and kill that 24-week baby, but you know what? They passed this law, and boy, just, you know. No, of course, they're going to let them come in and say, shh, right, 19 weeks. I mean, come on, let's get this done. $3,000 cash is good money. And so, you know, so we're taking all this angst, all this energy, all this enthusiasm in this country. We just had a big march for life, and tens of thousands of young people were down there marching. You know, there's a lot of young people that are pro-life. They don't like abortion. They don't want to see abortion. But all that energy is getting bottlenecked into this strategy of pragmatism that has no foundation, and it therefore is falling apart and is leading to the perpetuation of abortion on demand.
And that's why we need abolitionism.
That's why we need abolitionism. That's why I'm an abolitionist.
Thank you.
Is we're saying let's stand on principle.
All right. No compromise.